Okay, welcome to another Origin seminar today. During the talk, please keep yourself muted and also turn off your video just to help save some bandwidth for the people that have trouble connecting. Also, during the talk, if you have any questions, please let us know in the chat and also try to keep them for the end of the presentation, unless it's a very urgent question to make the current figure, like to ask a question about the current slide, but otherwise try to keep it to the end. So today we have a talk by George Eisner, who's a professor at the University of Arizona. He studies star and planet formation and develops instrumentation and techniques to enable the observations of these processes. And he's currently working to probe potential planet formation zones around young stars with a variety of novel techniques. So the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me online here. And I don't want to contradict the instructions, but I'm willing to take questions. I actually am happy to do it, especially with this online format. So I would just ask, if you want to ask a question, maybe turn your video on if you can, so I can see who's asking the question. That would be helpful. Okay, other than that, I will go ahead and get started. So you see the title of my talk is ELT Imaging of Protoplanetary Disks and eventually Protoplanets. And ELT here means extremely large telescopes. And sort of the point of this talk, or the joke of it, if you like, is that we have an ELT now, which is the LBT. So we don't have to wait for the GMT, the TMT, the EELT, et cetera. We already have an ELT that we can use today to do some of the science that everyone's building these huge telescopes to do. And I'm going to tell you in particular, I'll talk about technique and I'll talk about challenges and problems and you know how we solve them. And then I'm going to show you some science results that are mostly drawn from this new paper by Steph Salem, also a lot of participation from Jeremy Dietrich and Jordan Stone, some other LBT aficionados. And you'll see those results throughout the talk, throughout sort of the second half of the talk. Okay, so let me go ahead and get started. All right, so what am I talking about? I'm really talking about planets, exoplanets, planet formation, protoplanets. And those are all related to protoplanetary disks, and that's what I want to just make sure everyone is on the same page about before moving on. So what I have on the screen here is a picture of the solar system, not drawn. The planets aren't drawn to scale. I think the orbits probably are, but you see we have several planets. There's different kinds. There's the inner planets that are all pretty close. Then you go out further and you have these giant planets. Compositions vary more or less as a function of stellar-centric distance. And so any theory of planet formation really has to start here, and it has. We've had theories of planet formation for hundreds of years. There's what's called the proto-solar nebula, or the nebular hypothesis. This goes back to Kant, Laplace, probably people before that, who had this idea that there's sort of an ecliptic plane. We see planets more or less in one orbital plane, so maybe they formed in a disk, and indeed that was a pretty prescient observation for our solar system and for others. So we don't just know about our solar system, right? Every theory has to start with that, because those are the ones we know the most about, easiest to study, but we now know those are not the only ones out there. There are many, many more. This is a plot I made just for you. You see it's made on October 7th, 2020. Showing you the planet's mass as a function of semi-major axis and radius in color coding. So basically everything on here, if it has a mass measurement, that means it either has a radial velocity where you can determine a mass, or it has a radius measurement that can be converted into a mass from a mass-radius relationship. And everything that doesn't have an explicit radius measurement pretty much means that's a radial velocity or microlensing detection. So what you can see is that there are some Jupiters that have been detected, a whole bunch, right? The black points and the green points. And there's a whole bunch of these Neptunes. Those are that's Kepler's bread and butter, most of these Neptunes. So our theories of planet formation should hopefully explain all these kinds of planets, this diversity of planetary systems, not just in our system, our own solar system, but in all these others as well. And there are many, many planets, right? New ones being discovered every day. Here's the one iteration of the Kepler orrery, showing a lot of these Kepler multi-planet systems, showing you again the great diversity. Many of them are very tightly packed, but many of them are not. There are some wide orbit systems, just lots and lots of them, great diversity. Here's another example. I know some of you have seen my talks before, have seen this one. I love that this was discovered in 2005, right? No one cared about planets anymore by 2005. And you can see it's not really true. Everyone still cares about planets. Whether or not, it's just another planet or what, it always tells us something new. All right, so those were, most of these things are what we would think of as mature exoplanets. So not the very young planets, which I will mostly be talking about as the talk progresses. So these are planets that are more or less fully formed. Maybe they still retain some heat, so they're young in that sense, but they're not actively forming. And here's some examples. On the left here, you see the HR 8799 system imaged with LBT, this multi-planet system with 4 known planets around an A star. These planets are all pretty much further away than the Jupiter-like and inner planets in our solar system. So it's not a direct analog, but it's a multi-planet system, pretty exciting stuff. On the right is the Beta Pic planet companion. So we have direct images of planets, in a few cases, mostly around these somewhat older stars. Some people call them young, but I would call them for this talk mature exoplanets. And I chose these two for a reason, which is that they also have disks around them. These are relatively old stars, but they're still surrounded by debris disks. So on the left, you see a picture of what the disk around HR 8799 is thought to look like. It's got this inner ring and then the outer disk, and that's inferred from work by Kate Su, and other people have done stuff like this, modeling the spectral energy distributions of the system to see where the excess emission produced by dust lies. On the right, that's a direct image of the debris disk around Beta Pic. Right? That was the first disk ever imaged. It's a famous debris disk. So the planet was really the new discovery there as opposed to the disk, but it has both, right? There's a disk, there are planets. We shouldn't be surprised by this because disks and planets are linked. The planets probably form out of the disks, as do the stars. All right, so let's just drive that point home. Right up on the right here, I have just a picture that I made, a little sketch about the star formation process that also incorporates the planet formation process. So you start with this core, roughly spherical cloud of stuff that's going to become gravitationally unstable and collapse. And everything in the universe has some angular momentum, including this collapsing cloud. And as it starts to collapse, it has to conserve that angular momentum. So material mostly does not fall directly into the center. It falls onto a rotating and rotationally supported disk. That disk is relatively long-lived. It doesn't just fall in on a free fall time. It then has to transport angular momentum somehow. We think of this as a viscous process. That time scale is much longer. So the stuff in the disk, dust, gas, sticks around for a while. And that's good because it provides this reservoir material for forming planets. So the fact that we have planets and disks linked is both good and unsurprising. The disks are an integral consequence of star formation, just angular momentum conservation. Those disks sit there for a while and have material to make planets. So it's all sort of part of the same picture. And on the bottom left here, I'm just showing you a picture compiled about the positions of all the known bodies in the solar system as of several years ago, at least. The little white arrow things, those are comets. And those are pretty much the only things that are not found in the orbital plane of everything else. The exception being Pluto. That's one of the reasons Pluto is not thought to be a planet like the others, right? All the other planets are in a common orbital plane. Almost all the other asteroids, Kuiper belt bodies, things like that are close to that same orbital plane. That's because they all probably formed in that disk that was orbiting around the young sun as it was accreting material from it. All right, so I've hopefully established for you all the link between disks and planets, the fact that exoplanets is an interesting field. And now what I'm going to talk about for the rest of it is the earliest stages of exoplanets and even before the exoplanets are there, so the formation process. This is a really nice picture, I think, from Bill Saxton, illustrating that rough cartoon that I drew with nicer artwork. So you've got your cloud, it collapses to form that rotating disk, still some of that remnant cloud around it. By the way, these debris trails are not supposed to be physical trails. They're just sort of timelines, go from one to the other in time. Then you move on down that trail and you get to a point where you still have your disk, but now planets have started to form and they're eating up the material in the disk, clearing out these gaps. And then ultimately you get to something that looks more like a solar system, where the disk is more or less gone, but its dynamical signature remains in the orbital plane of those planets going around the star. Right, and we can ask in particular, in terms of understanding planets and their formation, what happens during these two times in this diagram? How does the disk evolve in order to make it amenable to certain kinds of planet formation or to constrain the types of planets that can form? And how do those planets form? How does that forming planet become a mature planet? And those are things we can address by observing protoplanetary disks at different stages of their evolution. And obviously, spatial resolution is an important part of this study, any study like this, because the planet formation process is happening on the sort of scales that we associate with planetary systems, tens of AU typically. Tens of AU in young star forming regions, it's a pretty small angular scale. So there's a pretty big observational challenge here. All right, any clarification questions or anything before I move on? I'll take silence as a no. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about a specific way of observing the planet forming regions in protoplanetary disks, and I'm going to focus on using the LBT. So I've got a picture here of the LBT on the top. You see those two 8.4 meter mirrors on this common mount, edge-to-edge separation of 23 meters, up on Mount Graham here in Arizona. And on the bottom there, I have a picture of the LBTI instrument. So that green trussed structure there holds the optics and other equipment to transport those beams from the two 8.4 meter apertures and bring them to a common focus. And that's what puts the eye in the LBTI. We combine the beams from the two telescopes and we synthesize the LBT interferometer instead of just using two 8.4 meter telescopes on their own. Okay, so that's really the key of this, the technical part of this talk, is we're getting a 23 meter telescope effectively. Now you could just go ahead and use the LBTI, make images, and use the weird PSF and see what you can do. That's not what I'm going to do in this talk. That's not what I'm going to tell you about. The reason, which I'll elucidate in the next few minutes, is that if you do that, your PSF stability, your PSF knowledge, I'll tell you a little more about what PSF is. I assume everyone knows, though, is not great. So you can't really do high precision imaging. You can't get very close to the star. And so to alleviate those imperfections in the imaging process, I employ this technique, or my group employs this technique, non-redundant masking interferometry. This image on the right here is a picture of one of the masks. This is the main mask that we use. So you see that there's a big circle, and then there's two clusters of dots and two small circles. And each one of those small circles pretty much corresponds to one of those 8.4 meter apertures. And this little disk sits in the middle of that green truss, basically. So this disk is about the size of a quarter. It's sitting in a compressed beam. It doesn't have to mask the entire aperture. It doesn't have to be 23 meters in size. It can just be this small sort of 1 inch thing. All right, so why do I use masking? Well, to explain that, I'm going to start with why is it difficult to do imaging? And I think there's some fundamental things about imaging that are worth discussing that we don't always think about, so it may just be worth reviewing. And one really big thing that I will point out at the outset here is that we never see the true sky brightness distribution, right? No matter what we do, we're not making an image of the source that truly represents the source in every way. And that's because we're always observing a sky brightness distribution through an imaging system. And that imaging system has a diffraction limit, no matter how big or small it is. And that diffraction introduces a point spread function, if you like, or a diffraction pattern, if you like. And so we always view our source, which I write here as BD, brightness distribution, the intrinsic brightness distribution of an astronomical object, convolved with the diffraction pattern of our imaging system. So you could call it the optical transfer function. I will just usually call it the PSF, or the point spread function. This image that you see on the right is this point spread function for a laser. So this is kind of the best you're ever going to do, a frequency stabilized point source in a temperature controlled environment where you've really got great stability, you can make this PSF. This is observed. If we were interacting now, I would quiz you, what's the shape of the aperture that this was observed with? Hopefully you know that it's a circular aperture because you have an Airy function here. So the Airy function is the point spread function for a circular filled aperture. You see all these Airy rings, as we call them. So beyond the various nulls in the diffraction pattern, you have these bright things. Right, so this is a laser spot, and this is what we would observe. This is our image of a laser spot. It's obviously not what a laser spot truly looks like. It's just what it looks like through this imaging system. This is generally true for anything we're going to look at on the sky. We have to observe it through an imaging system. So if we want to reconstruct a true brightness distribution, we would have to deconvolve that point spread function. And I wrote some math here that shows you, more or less how you would do this if you just wanted to do math and do this easily. So you know that convolution looks like multiplication if you take Fourier transforms. So if you took the Fourier transforms of everything, you would just say that the Fourier transform of the image is the Fourier transform of your sky brightness distribution times the Fourier transform of your point spread function. So you would just invert that equation, say, oh, I can recover the brightness distribution on the sky as an inverse Fourier transform of the quotient of those two quantities. Sounds simple enough. Of course, it is not really that simple. Deconvolution algorithms exist. People certainly use them, but it's not really as easy as it looks, and you're never going to do perfectly. A big reason it's not easy is that you usually don't really know what the point spread function is. You might think you know your imaging system quite well, but you don't know what the atmosphere or the air right above it in your lab or whatever is doing to the incoming wavefronts. And those deformations in the phase are going to change your point spread function. Also, any deformations in your telescope that can be static or quasi-static time variable, like thermal deformations, path length changes, those will also change the point spread function with time. So you not only don't really always know what it is at time zero that well, you don't know what it is at any given time when you're observing. That makes it very difficult to measure and to calibrate. Even if you measured it once, then you went and looked at a different source, the PSF could have changed. All right, so that makes it very difficult to do this sort of deconvolution effectively, and that makes the imaging problem difficult. And this is where non-redundant masking interferometry comes in. It does really two things, the second one listed here being the key one. It gives us very precise knowledge of our PSF. We make a mask, we know exactly where those holes are. The PSF is very simply related to the positions of those holes. So that's step one. We kind of know what our instrumental PSF looks like to a high degree of accuracy. Step two is we still have atmosphere over this mask and this imaging system, but we can use a trick, a differential technique essentially. And this is where the non-redundancy comes in, which I'll talk about more in a couple minutes, to cancel out almost all of these time variable effects, in particular the atmosphere. By canceling out all those atmospheric effects, we basically had a high precision differential technique, very precise PSF knowledge, and very precise PSF calibration. That allows us to get really, really good resolution because we can deconvolve, if you want to think of it that way, deconvolve this PSF, look inside of that first Airy ring or inside of really that central Gaussian core of the Airy function and do super resolved imaging, or certainly diffraction-limited imaging. Right, so this is, again, that mask. That Airy function that you saw behind this would be the PSF of just a circle. This mask, now the PSF is different, right? It's basically a sine wave for each of those pairs of holes. And just to make that explicit, let me show you. These are actual Fourier transforms if you care, but I've sketched out what the mask looks like with light going through two slits. You've all seen the two slit experiment. The PSF is just the two slit intensity pattern, right? So you get the light coming through two slits. That gives you a sinusoid function, which I've sketched out on what you see in the image below that one. If I had two different holes, I would get a different fringe pattern, a different sinusoidal function. And if I didn't say it already, this would be for a point source. So this would be the point spread function, the PSF. So the longer baseline gives you a tighter fringe spacing, a higher fringe frequency, shorter baseline, the opposite of that. And a cool thing about this is that you can think about any PSF as a combination of all of these. If I have a mask, but I just put the continuous distribution of all the holes, That would be like having a regular circular aperture. And this is in one dimension. Adding all those up, I get an Airy function. Okay, so the these PSFs really are PSFs, and one way of seeing that is that you get your conventional telescope PSF by adding them all up. All right, so everything I've shown you now is just intensity, but we also have to worry about phase when you're doing imaging in any way, shape, or form. The reason is because the phase of the light that comes in tells you something about where it came from on the sky. To illustrate that, I've just drawn you this fringe pattern here for a source that's on axis. What happens if I change the source to being off axis? Well, now I have a delay between the waves coming to one side and the other side, and that delay means that when those two things are combined, that fringe pattern shifts a little bit in phase. So if I blink between these, you see I've got that fringe pattern shifting because the source is on or off axis. All right, so that's very convenient because we can directly use that for, say, astrometry, but also for imaging. We need to know where a brightness distribution component is on the sky to really reconstruct an image. If you like, in conventional imaging or conventional high contrast imaging lingo, you could think of this as speckles, right? You have an on-axis speckle or an off-axis speckle of your source. Why do we think of that as speckles? What's causing the speckles? Well, so usually we think of speckles as being caused by atmospheric distortions. So why does a speckle go off axis when the atmosphere distorts the incoming wavefronts? Well, if I introduce a phase delay, that does the same thing as if I shifted the source to being off axis. It makes one of the beams look like it's delayed relative to the other one, and that introduces a shift in the phase. So for conventional imaging, that would force the speckle off. I have a bunch of phase variations, and that forces speckles to be all over my seeing disk, right? For this simple case of just a mask with one pair of holes, it's just shifting the phase of that sinusoid. That's the effect on the point spread function. Right, but this is pretty sinister. It means I can't recover any information about the intrinsic source phase. All I'm really measuring is atmospheric phase. That's changing with time. So I can't actually do diffraction-limited imaging if I have this phase problem, this phase variation from the atmosphere. So we can try to do adaptive optics correction to correct some of that. That's a common technique that works pretty well, but it leaves residuals. So instead, what I'll tell you about, what we use, is what's called closure phase, something that's enabled by this non-redundant masking. And this is the differential part of the technique. So what I've sketched here are three telescopes. You could think of them as three holes in a mask on the LBT or whatever. There's a cloud over one of them drawn here, but really there's clouds and atmosphere over each of them, and that atmosphere is a little bit different over each aperture. So we can write out what we measure, these phases that we measure. The ones on the left mean measured phases, the phi naughts mean the intrinsic phases, and then these lowercase phi's are the atmospheric additions, if you want, over each aperture. So the phase we measure on this pair of apertures 1, 2, well, that's the intrinsic phase that the source would have if there was no atmosphere or any other phase distortions, plus that extra phase that's found over aperture 2 minus the extra phase over aperture 1. We can write the same quantity for all three of those. And you see that if we add those three up, we can construct this quantity called the closure phase, the sum of those three, which cancels out every one of those lowercase phi's. So we have a quantity now, which is really the sum of phases around a triangle, which the measured quantity is equal to the intrinsic quantity. And that's really the strength of this technique. We don't have any residuals from atmosphere as long as we've made a coherent measurement. So it's sort of always better than adaptive optics, because your adaptive optics can never get perfect. This is pretty much as close to perfect as you can get. So what's the deal with non-redundancy? Those are some words that are thrown in there. Well, basically what this means is if I had three triangles that looked identical but were in different parts of the aperture, I would not be able to separate where the phases had come from. And so I wouldn't be able to remove it perfectly. Another way you could think of it is, say I just had two baselines that look just like 1, 2. So I'd have a phase 1, 2 and a phase 1, 2 prime, and I wouldn't know where the atmosphere was over 2 versus 1 for which 2 and 2 prime. It would just be redundant. So non-redundancy ensures that we can measure those atmospheric phases over each one and subtract them so that we can really get rid of them and zero them out. Okay. So one other thing I just want to say is I mentioned adaptive optics. Let me just point out for this technique to work, these closure phases have to be measured before the atmosphere changes much. Right? If I let the phase smear around, if the atmosphere is smearing those phases around over time, then I measure some average quantity, which has noise in it. Then I try to subtract it, and I've lost. Right? I no longer have a perfect measurement. Similarly, if my subapertures are so big that the phase is changing, the atmospheric change is changing across that subaperture, again, I'm averaging and introducing errors. So I want my subapertures to be small, and I want the integrations to be short. That will severely limit the sensitivity and thus the targets I can look at. And I want to do science with this. I want to look at young stars, eventually planets. That means I need sensitivity. And a way to do that is to extend those coherence scales. So I can extend the spatial coherence and the temporal coherence using adaptive optic systems. And for the LBT, a co-phasing system, which is essentially a simple adaptive optic system between the two sides. So that's why we're using everything at the same time to get sensitivity, to improve our measurements, to lower the phase residuals, and then using this differential technique to really zero those errors and get ultra high precision. Okay, so how long have I taken so far? It looks like almost half an hour, which is fine. I'll go through this kind of quickly. You already said that, right? When you observe through a mask, you have the superposition of all of those fringes for each pair of holes. You sum them up, that would be your PSF for this imaging system. So the image we get for a point source would be the sum of fringes, some messy thing we often call the interferogram. As I said earlier, if we had all those fringes, so no mask, right? If we just were adding up every fringe across a circular aperture, we'd recover the area function PSF. Although for the LBT, I guess I should say, you don't do that because you have two area function PSFs with a baseline between them. So it's a different PSF, and it's already messier. So with the mask, what we actually do is we measure the closure phases and amplitudes around every possible triangle of holes. So the fringe amplitudes and these fringes summed up around these triangles. And then we can do two things with those. We can directly use those measurements and then take models and compute those same quantities and compare them. So that's parametric modeling, forward modeling, whatever you want to call it. That's a typical interferometric technique. But in our case, because we're measuring so many amplitudes and closure phases, we have enough to reconstruct an image of the source by just taking those and essentially Fourier transforming them back into the sky plane and reconstructing the image. Now, we can't do that perfectly. We don't have all the information. So we use some tricks like saying we want to maximize entropy. We enforce positivity. We're adding some missing information in the imaging process. But the key point, which I'm going to show you, is that with these masks and sufficient sky rotation during the observations, we can reconstruct model-independent images. So these are not parametrically constrained models. We just take the data, we throw them into an image reconstructor, and we get out an image, and we can more or less trust that image as long as we've taken enough data. And I'll just note, if you didn't want to work in Fourier space, you don't have to. You could just treat those interferograms as images and attempt to deconvolve them in some other way. That's more or less mathematically equivalent. Some people try to do stuff like that, but I'll tell you about these Fourier techniques I like because I'm an interferometry person and I'm used to them. All right, so here is actual on-sky data. This is some of the commissioning data we took when we started using this mask at the LBT. And what you're seeing here are the fringe amplitudes, or the power spectrum for all the holes across the mask. These are the power found in what we call the intra-aperture baselines, so all the holes that are within a single LBT aperture. These red circles tell you the holes that go from one to the other. One hole in one side, one hole in the other, so we're getting those inter-aperture baselines up to 20 plus meters. So this imaging system, this PSF, is basically an ELT imager. We've got 23 meter imaging scales represented here. We can measure these closure phases and amplitudes, reconstruct an image on this 23 meter scale. All right, any questions? Anyone want to ask any questions before I plow ahead? Is everyone still there? Anyone still there?
We're here.
Okay, good. All right, so here is something to put a little bit of this in context, right? The left, now I'm actually showing you what we call UV coverage, very similar to a power spectrum. but you can see it looks a little different, right? This was the power spectrum I showed you. This is just for a snapshot. On the left, this is the UV coverage. So it's all the power we measured with sky rotation. So you can see there's sort of 25, 30 degrees of sky rotation here. So we've got more points measured in this space. We measured power on not just the baselines in a snapshot, but then the sky rotated. So we got different angles on the sky, constraining different position angles on our source brightness distribution. For those of you more comfortable with PSFs, which is probably everybody, the image on the right shows you the PSF that you would get from that UV coverage on the left. And you can see it looks kind of like that LBT typical PSF. You have your central core, those two prominent side lobes on the outside. Essentially what this is it's an Airy function for an 8.4 meter telescope with a fringe for a 23 meter pair of holes superposed on it. And so you can see that in the central core, the vertical direction, that more or less has the resolution of an 8.4 meter telescope. In the horizontal direction, that's more or less the resolution of a 23 meter telescope. So that's the deal. We get that really high resolution, at least along position angles that we've been able to rotate our long baselines to. And ideally, we would do this with 50 plus degrees of sky rotation. That's what we'd like to do. This is just early days data. This is what we've gotten so far. All right, and I'm gonna show you data where we studied this young star, MWC297. I don't know if anyone's ever called this the hamburger star. I would surely think you'd want to based on this picture. But it's kind of a funny thing because this was just an artist's conception from a press release associated with this Malbay et al. 2007 paper. And they drew this really nice picture of a disk with an outflow. I think in this case, the disk is supposed to be the stuff in the middle and the outflow is supposed to be the glowing stuff on the top and bottom. And then they say, and just to show you this could be like a forming solar system, there's the scale of the solar system. What's kind of funny about this is there's two things. One is this doesn't represent the data that Malbay et al. Took really in any way, because the data that Malbay et al. Took suggests it's a very face-on distribution, whereas this picture is showing you the edge-on distribution. So they just took their model and sort of made it edge-on and then tried to sketch out what it would look like. The other thing I think is ironic is that the image that I'm going to show you that we made ends up looking remarkably like this. So life imitates art ultimately. So here on the left, I've shown you the data on which that model was based. So this is visibility amplitude squared on your y-axis versus baseline length on the x-axis. So these are basically just the amplitudes, not phases, not closure phases. So not great imaging. And then these curves are showing you face-on, the prediction of face-on models in the K-band and the H-band. And the fits are pretty decent to face-on models, right? So it looks more or less like a face-on disk. The Malbay team got that one data point that says amber on it. The iota were from an earlier study. The PTI data, this brought up a pleasant memory. I took those data when I was in grad school and I had forgotten about it. So I've actually looked at this source before with a long baseline interferometer. Anyways, it looks more or less face-on. And that has been a kind of thorn in people's side who want to understand this source for quite a long time. Do I have any questions? Oh, okay. Ben points out there is a disk known as Gomez's hamburger. It's not this source, though. So I wanted to make this point that the data here really suggest a face-on disk. Okay, the imaging data suggests that. And this is kind of in a lot of tension with the V sin I measured for the star. So the V sin I tells you the rotational velocity of the star. If this was a nearly face-on star, that V sin I measurement would imply that the star would break up. It would be rotating so fast that it wouldn't be gravitationally bound. So basically we know that's not happening, right? The star is there, it hasn't flown apart, so it can't be face-on, and really you want it to be much closer to edge-on to make it not fly apart. Having a star, having its angular momentum vector be terribly misaligned with the disk can be done. It's not that easy to do. It usually induces dynamical structures in disks like warps or things like that, or you have to have a companion. So these were things we were looking for. And what I'll show you is our data actually, I think, resolve this question in a much nicer way. So here is the data we measured for this source with the LBTI and the masking. And you can just compare those, right? This was the state of the art before. You had sort of a handful of measurements at a handful of baselines. Here we're really filling in that short baseline space up to 20 meters, and we don't have a lot of gaps, right? We collect a ton of data because we have a lot of baselines. We can make a pretty good measurement, and that allows us to reconstruct our images. And this also shows you a point I was harping on earlier, which is that closure phases, since they're a differential measurement, can be calibrated, measured to very high precision. So on the top here, you see again these squared amplitudes of those fringes. Those we have sort of 5% precision. Maybe you think it's even a little worse after calibrating. And that's because it's sort of ad hoc calibration to some extent, right? We observe a source, we observe a PSF calibrator, we do our best to match them up and figure out what the instrument in the sky was doing. The closure phases, we don't have to worry about that, right? We think we've taken time variability out of it. And these are calibrated to more like 1%. And this is, like I said, kind of early days data with this dual aperture system, and still we're able to get this sort of 1% precision imaging data. That's why we can do really nice imaging very close to the star. We have good PSF knowledge and calibration. And here is the image that we reconstructed from those data. Or I should say that Steph Salem reconstructed from those data. And you see several interesting things. One is seems to be a companion, this thing marked A, that's sitting there not near the central source. And then we have our main source, which has compact flux, which we think is not just the star. We think it's something like star plus hot circumstellar material around it. And then we have this interesting structure that reminds us a lot of an X. And so we interpret that as being probably something akin to an outflow cavity that's glowing from that central compact source, illuminating the edges of the outflow cavity. And the really nice thing about this interpretation is that if you just took this and observed it with a very simple interferometer like Amber at VLTI, so the data I was showing you before, this may very well look kind of like a face-on thing, right? It doesn't look extremely edge-on because it's got vertical extent. You would think about smoothing this, you'd probably get something that looks kind of like, centrosymmetric, etc. Oh, I guess I should point this out. Something about these closure phases that is important is they're not zero. Any centrosymmetric source would have closure phases of 0. This source has very non-zero closure phases, which tells us that it has to have very much asymmetric emission. And we already knew we were going to get an interesting image pretty much just from looking at these closure phases because they weren't all 0. All right, anyway, so these simpler measurements don't have closure phases, just measuring amplitudes. You smooth this out, it might look like a face-on thing. This doesn't look face-on at all, right? This looks like it's probably more like an edge-on disk that gives you this outflow cavity in the orthogonal direction of the disk, looking more like that hamburger picture that we saw the artist make at the beginning. And the beauty of this sort of structure that just came out of the data, we hadn't really thought about it before, is it resolves that V sin I problem. Everything's edge-on now, right? The star can be edge-on, the disk's edge-on. We're seeing this structure because it's an outflow cavity that's perpendicular to the disk. So it's nice, it hangs together physically, and we seem to have this new companion. All right, is that chat for me? What does the PSF look like for this image? Do the side lobes? No, so they do not. It was the PSF I showed you earlier. That was the PSF for this image, and I can go back to that if you'd like. From Joe Najita, what are the other wispy structures? They seem to echo the X structure. If this is a physical companion, what is the physical distance? Okay, so let me answer these in turn. Yes, so you might be concerned about these residuals that I wouldn't say look very X-like, but they are sort of straight up and down along this general axis. And I'm not going to say that we are totally confident that we're not just picking up residuals. We did do a bunch of noise simulations, and we can make structures that look kind of like this in 5% of them, I would say. So at that level of confidence, I think it's fair to say you could be contaminating your image with these residuals. The other question was about physical separation. It's less than 10 AU. I believe it's something like 8 to 12. It's in the 10 AU range. Maybe it's a little less even, but it's sort of in the typical range you'd expect. This is an O star, right? This is a separation range that's quite expected for massive stars like this. The other point I'll make about these residuals, and I told you something about the noise tests, but we did push pretty hard on this. First, I'll just show you this, I guess, which is showing you that if I take my image, reconvert it into closure phase and visibility amplitude data, it fits the data quite well. Let me just look at what question just popped up. I should say people should feel free to speak their questions because I can't actually read the chat without bringing up another window. Do you see the outflow at any other wavelengths? No, we don't have data at any other wavelengths. This is the only data. These are the only wavelength we have data at this point.
You might not, but nobody else has looked at this source.
Not at this scale. This is the highest resolution image of this source, except for these VLT data, which are much simpler in their imaging. So,
but I guess I would expect the outflow. I mean, you don't need quite as high resolution to see the outflow if it was going. If you would see it at longer.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right? If you had radio data, I would expect it to be.
Yeah, I don't remember what that looks like. I think there is evidence for outflow along this position angle, but I don't remember if it matches up perfectly.
Okay.
All right, so here's just another test. We looked at to see if we were really getting model independent images. We fed in a bunch of different priors that don't really look like the images that come out to see if we would always get those images back. And sure enough, we pretty much do. We can put something as simple as a delta function or something as complex as 2 delta functions plus a skewed Gaussian disk. No matter what you put in, you're more or less always getting this structure that looks like this outflow cavity, and the companion pops up every time as well. So this is the first time we've really been able to do this with an ELT, to make a model independent image where we're not really putting in any prior knowledge. These are very generic priors. It doesn't really matter which one we use. And I'll just contrast that briefly with another source we looked at where we got less sky rotation. We didn't really have enough to make these model independent images. This was MWC 349. And here you can see we tried several different models. They all basically fit the data as well. We couldn't really tell which one was a true image. The images just changed with what prior we put in. So all we could tell was that it had to look something like this size scale and have some amount of skew. But other than that, we really couldn't do better. So this data I've been showing on MWC 297 is really quite exciting for us because we could just make an image and see all the complexity and not have to worry about the physics of what was causing it. We could then think about that later. This is what the MWC 349 image looks like, superposed on a radio image of recombination lines, where you can see this outflow traced on larger scales and the more or less highly inclined disk in the middle of it. All right, so last 10 minutes or so, let me ask, what about protoplanets? Because I promised I would get to it eventually. All right, so we're looking at some disks. For protoplanets, we really want to look at a different class of disks than the ones I've been showing you. Probably not these really, really bright ones that we've looked at now out of necessity, but these transition disks where there are big gaps that may be caused by ongoing planet formation. The reason we haven't done it is they're just too faint for our current LBTI co-phasing system. So basically the adaptive optics on each aperture works, but the co-phasing system for phasing up those 2 apertures doesn't work. So we can only look at systems that are bright enough so that either we can co-phase or the atmosphere isn't changing during an integration time. If we want to go fainter, we have to do more. So we've done 2 things. Step 1, which we've already done, is observe the largest transition disk clearings with single aperture non-redundant masking techniques. So like I said, the adaptive optics works there. We can already go deeper and do some sample of those. Step 2 is to extend the sensitivity of this full 23-meter imager. And I'll show you why even the ones we've done in step 1, we really want to do with that step 2 system. All right, this is old stuff. You've probably all seen this, slick calcium-15. On the left is an image in the radio of the inner rim of the disk with the large clearing inside. And on the right is non-redundant masking imaging in L and K band, and also this H alpha result from Magellan AO. And so we infer the presence of 3 companions here, B, C, and D. This is again from work by Steph Salem, Kate Follett, 2015, so it's kind of old. And Steph has been following this up still now she's doing it, so it's been 5 years plus at this point. And there's been some interesting hiccups, and maybe they're physically important, maybe it's something about our data that's weird. But something that's pretty interesting is this B component seems to have disappeared. We saw it for a couple years, and then it just faded and it's gone. We still see C and D, but you can see here there is no B where it should be, and that has continued for a while. Right, we've also been able to trace out the motions of those things. And this is really, I think, a key. These are rotating objects, right? These objects are orbiting around the central star. So whatever they are, they sure look to be orbiting with very high confidence. And I don't even have the most recent epochs on here. You can see 2 epochs for B missing. That's where B has disappeared. We don't see it anymore. The other ones continue to orbit. So they're moving around in circles. Now, here's part of why I would say this is somewhat controversial. Other people have looked at this, they see structure, and they attribute it to an inner disk. This is a paper from Thalman. There's another one that I think is pretty similar from Curry. And the idea here is they look at this, they see what I would call the inner disk, but there's another one inside of it even, which is this bright spot. Can you guys see, if you can see my cursor, hopefully that's helpful. This thing here, they say, is tracing an inner disk and not companions. Here's our image rotated to this epoch based on our orbital solutions. And you can see that things actually line up quite well between the 2 images. C and D are both there. B is actually not present in our data at this epoch, and it's not present here either. And for me, the big thing is that, like I said, these are rotating, right? You can see that this square has had to be rotated by almost 45 degrees between the epoch that I took this image in and this epoch here. So if this is an inner disk feature, it's presumably geometric. If it's forward scattering, it doesn't change with time, it doesn't orbit. So in my opinion, this scattered light from an inner disk is just totally not viable because it's an orbiting structure. What's actually here, though, I'd say, okay, we can let that remain controversial. We still have to investigate further. And here's a reason why I'm perfectly willing to accept that this is controversial and why I would like to have the 23-meter system. So I'm going to draw on this plot on the right the diffraction limit of a single LBT aperture at L prime. Right, so the radius of this circle is lambda over d. So what this is showing you is that pretty much all these components are right around lambda over d. And that's always difficult. Imaging at the edge of your diffraction limit, I told you I think we can do this with non-redundant masking because we have great calibration, but still might make you uncomfortable. It makes me a little uncomfortable that we're detecting things right at the hairy edge. Well, what if we could extend the sensitivity and hit this with the 23-meter system? Well, then our diffraction limit is that. Then there should be no uncertainty about what we're seeing. Then all this imaging is sort of standard 3 lambda over d. It's really easy stuff. We won't have any ambiguity about the images anymore. Should really nail down what the structure is. Case closed. So obviously this one would be great to follow up. And we'd like to follow up every transition disk that we can do with that higher resolution system. All right, so this is something we're working on. The upgrade is really being led by Jordan Stone. I'm working on it. Jaron Leisenring's working on it. Narsi Anuga's working on it. And the goal here is pretty much to extend the sensitivity of the co-phaser. And to do that, we want to build this instrument called FFTCAM, which would be a more sensitive co-phaser. This is something we're doing. We've already got a new detector. We're working on it. Jordan's now a scientist at National Research Lab, but he's able to focus a lot of his time on it, and he's getting resources for it, so it's great. And this is a plot he made showing pretty much where we think this will take us. So the blue line there is the current system sensitivity. It's about 5th magnitude in K. And that one star, AB Auriga, is pretty much the only young star that's even kind of accessible to this system. So we pretty much can observe nothing, almost none of these really typical young stars. I showed you the other two, MWC 349 and MWC 297, we were able to get with that sensitivity. And all those yellow stars are transition disks. We can't do any of them with the current system. With this upgrade, really just the detector and a little bit of work on mechanics and software of how we use our fringe tracker, we can get at least 5 magnitudes. We think maybe even more. And there's a new recent upgrade, Sol upgrade to the AO system. So this line's inching up also. So we're starting to open up a bunch of parameter space. This cyan point is like calcium 15. That'll be well within the parameter space. But there's also order 10 other transition disks and tens of other young stars that we can observe once we do that upgrade. So I'd say we're on the cusp of being able to make ELT images of a pretty good sample of very interesting young star and young planet targets. All right, I'll stop
Josh,
there.
oh yeah, you're done. Yeah. So there are two questions about the MWC 349 from Joan. She asks, does
I
the
can't
ring
see the
in,
chat
yeah,
window that well. Let's see.
I'll read it for you. Does the ring in the MWC 349 image have anything to do with the hydrogen masers in the system?
I don't remember. That paper is a few years old. Joan, do you remember what the scale is of the hydrogen masers? Because if they're on the right scale, then I would say yes. But I think they're hydrogen recombination line masers, so they might be in the outflow too. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the spatial distribution. I just remember it's a weird source because it had hydrogen masers, which are very uncommonly seen. So I think people were also debating whether it's young or old, and so I was just wondering whether
that one's more controversial about youth. I think MWC 297, at least it looks like it's old, but all these high mass young stars are sort of in that uncertain range of, are they even young stars or are they BE stars? Because all high mass stars are young in some sense, right? So
right.
All right,
well,
and then Ninka had
that's really cool.
Oh, did you have another question, Joan?
No, that was just really cool, and I'm just looking forward to see what happens next.
Okay, thanks. What if the inner disk contains an asymmetric structure which is rotating? In the calcium-15. Yeah, that would do it, but what is it? Because it's difficult to keep rotating structures coherent. They tend to shear out on dynamical times. So it could be a very recently created structure that would kind of do it, but then you have to say, well, it shears out in 1,000 years, the system's 10 to the 5 years, so you have a 1 in 10 to the 4 chance of catching it. It's just the probabilities are sort of bad, but that may be what it ends up being. That's why we really want to nail it down, I would say.
All right, other questions for Josh? All right. If not, we'll just have to have him come back in a few years and give us an update. I would like to invite everyone to unmute and thank Josh for an interesting talk.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Very good.